Hi, so I'm going to be discussing French psychology and more specifically the history and systems and influential figures from France and the field of psychology and how they've gone on to impact the general field of psychology as we know it to be today. Now, in other countries, excuse me, such as Germany and North America, it was fairly popular to promote specific schools of thought or adhere to exact theoretical approaches or prescribed methods. However, in the French-speaking world, I think psychology developed fairly differently. It's always been pretty eclectic in theory and practice, but still, regardless, French psychology got its start in the late 19th century. And to give you some context to that time period, the 19th century was sort of when psychology was truly becoming a science or seeking to gain recognition as a discipline of science. And as we've read, philosophical psychology was slowly becoming more scientific psychology. So when looking at French psychology in comparison to other countries such as Germany and North America, where the approach to scientific psychology was more experimental from the start, looking at French psychology, that was instead more built on the study of psychopathology through clinical method. There was a strong clinical tradition. And when approaching questions of the mind, there was a lot of emphasis on studying what happens when things go wrong. And how would they do that? Well, they would find patients with mental disorders, and they considered them natural experiments that would help us develop our understanding of the inner workings of the mind. Two important, I think, pillars of French psychology were Jean-Martin Charcot and Pierre Janet. And both of these influential figures spent time at, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, but the Salpêtrière, which is a famous mental and research hospital in Paris. And as you might expect, this was where a lot of clinical work was done also, and I'm sure the clinical tradition thrived there. And we'll also discuss many other French psychologists who are academic descendants of these two. So Jean-Martin Charcot, he mentored many influential and popular 20th century psychologists, and he fostered a lot of important changes in the field of psychology. Returning to the context of the time where philosophical psychology was becoming more of a scientific psychology, even from ancient times, there was a lot of speculation and theories out there about how mental processes might be linked to the brain and nervous system. By this time in the 19th century, physiology, including neurophysiology, was making real progress and contributing to the development of scientific psychology. And France really shined here. They made a lot of significant progress in neuroscience, largely thanks to Charcot. He played a great role in changing perspectives. And how did he do that? That was really by promoting psychology as a science of the mind. He, I think, also wanted to link psychological disorders to something tangible or something that could be studied, like under the scientific method. So a lot of his perspective came from a physiological basis, or that's what he wanted to study. And he studied the physiological basis of Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, and he was one of the first to treat psychological disorders such as hysteria as legitimate objects of study. I think he believed that the bizarre behaviors and experiences of hysterics that patients undergo might be due to impaired functioning in the nervous system. And again, that's rooted in a physiological or neurophysiological basis. So I think by painting a more general picture of neural and brain processes, scientific psychology as a field really began to get its start. And as you can see from this quote here, I like it because it illustrates the sociocultural context of the disorder based on the time period, especially pertaining to women's rights. Sexual frustration was considered a contributing factor to symptoms of hysteria. That's where the nymphomania symptom comes in. And I know that you all can note the term, especially repressed sexuality. Lo and behold, a very famous student of Charcot's, Sigmund Freud, took this idea and eventually weaved it into his complex theory of psychological disorders, which I'm sure we're all aware of on some level, but we'll get more into that later. So before we move on, I think it's important to address that in the early 1900s, again, psychology was actively percolating. There were a lot of diverse intellectual ideas out there about mental life. And although much of the 20th century sort of represented psychology's bid to become a bona fide science, I think that the search for legitimacy also required that the discipline reach some consensus on what counts as valid knowledge in the field of psychology. And so this time period also represented a drastic reduction in the number of theories that were considered viable because the field of scientific psychology was gaining its shape, which meant narrowing the pool of ideas about psychology and treating the field as a science that should adhere to, I think, standards of validity and reliability. So at the turn of the 20th century, French scientific psychology sort of followed the lead of a famous French figure named Pierre Janet, who we'll talk about next, and he emphasized clinical over experimental methods. So he is considered the father of French psychology. He was a clinical psychologist. And he was strongly influenced by one of the first foundings of scientific psychology, which was the psychology of consciousness, which I know we've been reading a lot about. This was established by Wilhelm Wundt. And as we've learned, this certainly impacted the convictions of Pierre Janet. He was strongly influenced also by spiritualism, which stems from René Descartes. And again, this theorist proposed an interactive dualism between the spiritual mind and the physical body. And spiritualism overall really studied the structure and process of the mind, mainly through introspection, and concluded that mental activity occurs at two levels, which are listed here. And this is something that Pierre Janet strongly believed in. The automatic level would be considered something that can include dreams, hallucinations, hypnotic states. And this also really ties in with another influential figure in Pierre Janet's life, which was Jean-Martin Charcot. He had worked with Charcot at the Salpêtrière, which was the research and mental hospital in Paris, where they had both encountered hysteric patients. So speaking of dreams, hallucinations, and hypnotic states, hypnosis was a popular therapeutic method to be used with hysteric patients. And I think here the collaboration between these two men sort of represented a bridge being built between philosophy and science, especially because Jean-Martin Charcot was hugely into neurophysiology. So you might otherwise see this as like a marrying of the spiritualism perspective of the mind and the neurophysiological perspective of the mind. And I think Janet began to join together these two camps as he was working with hysteric patients. The automatic level of mental activity, which he had learned about through spiritualism, he attempted to apply that to the symptoms of hysteria that he saw in his patients. For instance, some of the behaviors that he witnessed being performed under hypnosis were usually not recalled upon the patient's awakening. And that, so especially being introduced to the idea of automatism, which is a behavior that is performed without conscious awareness. He was also being introduced to the idea of anesthesia that Charcot had suggested was a key feature of hysteria, and anesthesia is the loss of sensation or movement in a limb that can't be accounted for by damage to the nervous system. It's just unexplained loss of sensation or movement. And Janet began to speculate that there was potentially a connection between the automatic activities of the spiritualists, or the automatic level, and this seeming bizarre anesthesia of hysteric patients, because both concepts sort of hinted at something that was happening at a subconscious level. So these influences led Genet to his concept of the subconscious. From here, he pioneered what's called the two-stage model of consciousness, and this fits well, as you can see, with the spiritualist philosophy that he had long subscribed to. Instead of labeling them as voluntary and automatic mental processes, they're now just recognized as the conscious and the unconscious. And by introducing the concept of subconsciousness in this way with the two-stage model, I think this really represented a pivotal milestone in French psychology, which was a melding of philosophical and clinical approaches to psychology in France. And speaking of levels of consciousness and applying this to psychopathology seen in clients and traumatic experiences that patients might have been through, he also developed the idea of dissociation. And this idea was introduced because at the time, the notion of multiple personalities was being debated in the field of psychology. And this topic was considered incredibly controversial because the self had long been believed to be a unitary entity. But Genet instead proposed that multiple personalities still represent parts of the same self, but he borrowed the concept of someone having energy, and that was borrowed from physics. And he basically believed that people in good mental health should have sufficient psychic energy to integrate their life experiences into a unified sense of self. However, for instance, traumatic events can be difficult to cope with, and they can drain us of the psychic energy that we need to integrate them. So they may instead be left as separate pieces of the subconscious, or the experiences may become fragmented, and that can largely be attributed to dissociation. So when a person dissociates, their experiences become fragmented, and Genet went on to sort of define these separate pieces of experience as fixed ideas that linger in the subconscious and are typically formed in response to traumatic events. A fixed idea, although it isn't consciously recalled, it exists in the subconscious. It can still create emotional disturbances in a person. And in response to this, Genet wanted to pioneer a potential treatment method. He was among the first to develop a systematic form of psychotherapy, which he called psychological analysis. And his hope was that this would be an approach that could identify and eliminate fixed ideas in a patient. And he explored various methods that would fall under the umbrella of psychological analysis and hopefully identify and eliminate fixed ideas such as hypnosis, because it's considered when a patient is in a suggestible state, they will relate they're more likely to relate their emotional issues or traumatic experiences that they might be unable or unwilling to do so when awake or discuss when awake. And I'm sure you'll note that within the name psychological analysis, that sort of rings a bell with Freud's psychoanalysis. There's clearly a lot of overlap between the two gentlemen's psychological theories. Genet certainly served as inspiration for Freud's later ideas. He, of course, mentored him. But Genet actually insisted that Freud had stolen his theory and claimed it as his own. Freud used many of the same methods in his own talking cure, but of course he referred to it as psychoanalysis. And there are many similarities that come up when comparing Genet's psychological analysis with Freud's psychoanalysis. But it's clear that Genet served as inspiration for Freud, and his teachings eventually carried over into what would eventually become the third founding of scientific psychology, otherwise known as the psychoanalysis movement, launched by Freud. So following the scientific revolution, being a natural scientist was largely considered to be using quantitative methods to measure subject matter and perform experiments. So this time period was really marked by embarkment on experimental and psychometric methods that came into existence. So this is where we cue the entrance of Alfred Binet. who I'm sure we've all heard of. He was a French psychologist who collaborated with Theodore Simon to produce the first reliable intelligence test. In the context of early 20th century French society, France had recently instituted a universal mandatory educational policy requiring that all children receive schooling. Before this time, schooling had been considered optional. But with this newly instituted mandate, they were confronted with the issue of, how do we deal with the wide range of abilities in any cohort of children? There's a lot of diversity and a lot of differing needs to be met. Binet actually joined a government commission to investigate this problem. Although he understood that there were considerable differences in intelligence, he also believed deeply in the power of education and how it should also be uniquely tailored to each student. So he went on to collaborate with Theodore Simon to construct this intelligence test, which was called the Metric Intelligence Scale, published, I think, in 1905. And it was the first reliable intelligence test, and it could identify children in need of special education. And if you read this quote here, if you need to pause, that's okay. But this was sort of considered revolutionary insight. And of course, the publication of this first intelligence test served as an important precedent set for the many intelligence tests to be developed in the future. Many tests today are derived from Binet Simon. So this was a very important milestone in French psychology. Now, Binet's creation of the intelligence test was actually only the tip of the iceberg of the more extensive work that he had been doing for a long time. And a lot of time he had spent actually studying childhood development. When measuring child intelligence, Binet found that intelligence not only varies among individuals, but also within a single individual over time. So capitalizing on the uniqueness of intelligence and how there's no single standard of intelligence and how it can be measured, this brought his pioneering of individual psychology to the forefront. He argued that children's thought processes are inherently different from those of grown-ups. And even within a particular age group, he argued that there can be considerable differences among individuals. And this sort of, I think, also introduced the concept that ways of thinking evolve as children grow older. And this was a perfect way of sort of teeing up or setting a precursor to Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist, and he piloted the theory of cognitive development, and he was greatly influenced by Pierre Janet, and spent a lot of his training doing clinical interviews with patients in mental hospitals. And of course, from this training experience, he quickly realized that he could collect data with more depth and breadth if he broke from more objective approaches. So from this, he went on to develop the clinical method, which he strongly endorsed as an investigative technique because he found it to be incredibly useful. And he wanted to put this method into practice when attempting to understand children and their cognitive development. And it really drove the point home of, although we can objectively observe children's responses, we aren't really getting at why they solve problems the way that they do. So probing at this question was much easier to do with the clinical method, which is more subjective and less objective. And so we have the stage model, which is considered one of the foundational theories of modern psychology, and it provides a basic framework for research in cognitive development. And it's based in Piaget's belief that children are actively engaged with their physical and social environments. And you could read the 3 terms I listed here, but I think this really fits within the foundings of psychology and adaptation, specifically our developing understanding of how individuals evolve and adapt according to their environment and what suits them best to fit and function within their environment. And this theory specifically posited that children are constantly adapting their understanding of the world to their changing circumstances. So you all can pause to read this, but I thought this was a really important main takeaway from the stage model. So this ultimately culminated into the stage model of cognitive development. Piaget, we know, theorized that children's understanding of the world goes through a series of transformations as they are reorganizing their mental structures to adapt to new experiences. And he split this into stages corresponding with certain age demographics and marked by certain milestones. Sensory motor being from the age span of infancy to the age of 2, where infants are learning about the world through their bodily sensations and muscle movements. Then moving to pre-operational, which is from the ages of 2 to 6, and children's reasoning is dominated by magical thinking rather than rational thought. Then concrete operational, where children are thinking logically with the aid of manipulated objects. And then finally, concluding with formal operational, which is post-puberty, and children are, or young adults are thinking logically about abstract situations, and they don't require the aid of manipulated objects. And there's a lot of, again, those terms as I introduced in the previous slides: assimilation, or incorporating new information into existing cognitive structures, or accommodation, where we may be developing new cognitive structures based on the information that we're gathering. And from here, Piaget actually went on to promote his own theory of knowledge acquisition, which is known as genetic epistemology. And this refers to the study of the origin of knowledge. The word genetic is derived from the word genesis, or has to do with origins. And as we've learned from the stage model, similarly to, like, as you note in the pre-operational stage, where they refer to reasoning being dominated by magical thinking, similarly to this process of that magical thinking being gradually replaced by reason, there is an interesting parallel to note with the way our collective society has proceeded to think and understand our own species. That level of understanding of where humanity came from has over time become less magical and evolved over the millennia. That was an important parallel that was made in our text that we read. And I think it drives home the point that the same processes of assimilation and accommodation take place, whether we're talking about evolving knowledge structures within an individual person, or when we're talking about humanity and our understanding of that. Again, I think the same knowledge processes take place within societies as a whole. Okay. Now, returning to our timeline, which is set throughout the 20th century, behaviorism has been dominating academic circles since the 1920s, and it was still alive and well post-World War II. However, throughout this time, Piaget was coming out of the woodwork and suggesting that knowledge exists neither solely in the person nor solely in the world, but rather in an interaction between the two. Given this time period, he spoke fairly boldly about knowledge structures, mental operations, and cognitive development, which flew in the face of the dominant behaviorist approach at the time. But lo and behold, this did spark an incredible movement that yielded repercussions that rippled into our thinking today. He inspired what was known as the cognitive revolution, and this made him one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, because he sort of sparked a verge or diverging from the dominant behaviorist approach, and encouraged more introspection and acknowledgement that knowledge is neither innate nor acquired through experience. So this sort of reiterates what I mentioned on the previous slide pertaining to Jean Piaget, but based on his stage theory of cognitive development, he prompted the wave of, or the cognitive revolution, which carried us through the rest of the 20th century, and it largely shaped where developmental psychology is today. So it significantly impacted our current thinking in the field of psychology. And then pertaining to another founding father of French psychology, Jean-Martin Charcot, he significantly shaped the thinking of early 20th century psychologists. Sigmund Freud and Pierre Genet were instrumental in the development of psychotherapy, and they were both mentored by Charcot, who modeled this method of helping his patients by talking with them, or talk therapy. And he also modeled skills of showing genuine concern for the patient and their welfare. So I think, that being said, Charcot shaped the thinking of early 20th century psychologists on both sides of the Atlantic. So that really sheds light on the far-reaching influence that he had. Pierre Genet was another mentee of his, and as well as Alfred Binet. They were both, and each of these men themselves had a significant or profound impact on the development of psychology in the early 20th century. Alfred Binet in terms of the intelligence movement and psychometrics, and then specifically with Pierre Genet as he joined the ideas from spiritualism with the neurophysiological approach of Charcot, that really married the concepts of philosophy and science within psychology. And I think also brought neuroscience and psychoanalysis closer together. So that's, I think, a very important influence to consider. So yes, I know I mentioned the intelligence wave, which was largely contributed to by Binet, as he produced the first standardized intelligence test, and he was following the work of his predecessors, including Charcot. In terms of neurology, Charcot largely contributed to psychology gaining recognition as a science of the mind. He was a renowned neurologist himself, and he contributed through his work to the recognition of neurology as a solid discipline, especially as he worked with psychological disorders such as hysteria. He was able to, I think, draw attention to the tangibility, or being able to practice scientific method and apply that to disorders that pertain to something less than tangible, like the inner workings of the mind. So he was a very industrious researcher and contributed to the wave of neuroscience, which is very popular in France. And neuropsychology really remains a prevalent part of French psychology today. And then finally, we have psychoanalysis, which, as we've already discussed, the influences of Charcot and Genet, who was a famous clinical psychologist and worked on hysteria and hypnotism, but really applied the influences of spiritualism, the Cartesian mind-body dichotomy, which I know we've all read a lot about. And this contributed to the many psychoanalytic principles that are adhered to and popularly espoused in French psychology, and have clearly carried over into the field of psychotherapy and what it looks like today. So I think that's another milestone to consider of French psychology that's also linked to French history and culture, and it was indelibly marked by Jean-Martin Charcot and other French figures in psychology. So that concludes my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed and learned something new or interesting. And I look forward to discussing with the class in the discussion chat. So thanks so much.